of his inalienable rights and aspiration to equip himself with the basic necessities such as adequate shelter, food, water, employment, and other services, to ensure equitable distribution of resources such as land and the benefits of economic development, to ensure that national and the world community will refrain from all forms of activities, aggressions, attitudes, and policies which encourage discrimination amongst mankind and relegation of one kind of the society to substandard of life. It is our view, Mr. President, that only in an atmosphere of tranquility, equality, and universal brotherhood that any national actions to be supported by international cooperation can be effectively ensured. Through these actions aimed at improving human settlements and the welfare of mankind as a whole can be stimulated. Regarding the areas of concern for this conference, Mr. President, it is the view of my delegation that the declaration of a package of principles, the identification of basic national actions and areas of international cooperation in themselves do not ensure the physical implementation of these aspirations. Indeed, Mr. President, the realization of the role of human settlements in overall national development implies that appropriate institutional, financial, and technological measures should be established through the setting up of specific targets and commitments to fulfill these targets. In this regard, therefore, we see the major task of global organs and exchange and international cooperation concerned with the facilitating mobilization and transfer of financial and technical resources, mobilization and transfer of human settlements technology, and the promotion of exchange of experience through conferences, research, and training. We consider these measures to be basic and would therefore appreciate it if Vancouver concentrates its efforts towards evolving a basis and a consensus of definite commitments and pledges by nations and other United Nations financial agencies to meet the target requirements for funding human settlement programs. We consider such commitments absolutely necessary and a strategy on which any number of actions and institutional arrangement can be hopefully based. Due to great importance Uganda attaches to this very serious subject of human settlements, Mr. President, Uganda pledges to contribute at an appropriate time towards the funds of any United Nations institution that will be decided to carry out the functions of human settlements as the result of the Vancouver recommendations. In our view, Mr. President, the next major step in international cooperation and national action in the field of human settlements concerns the need for establishing an appropriate, effective, and efficient institutional arrangements that can ensure the mobilization and utilization of available resources, coordination of related sectoral programs, and the promotion of overall economic development. In this respect, we see the global, regional, and national institutions equally desired. We would identify the responsibility of regional headquarters being operational in nature, dissemination of information, and a strengthening of intra-regional cooperation, especially in developing countries. Responsibilities of the global headquarters would include coordination of regional activities and related activities of United Nations systems, mobilization of resources, and transfer of skills and human settlements technology. In order to achieve the goals and objectives of human settlement, as I have expressed above, and indeed as have already been expressed by previous speakers, Uganda wishes to support fully the creation of an independent institutional United Nations body that can take care of this very important subject of human settlement. Regarding national action, Mr. President, my delegation wishes to further state the importance we attach to human settlement as a base for promotion overall national economic development on the one hand and as a process through which preventive solution to the problems of human environment, on the other hand, can be evolved and applied. Our concern for human settlements are evident in our desire and programs which aim at promoting the economic, social, and cultural development of the country. The strength of our economy, for instance, lies on the strength of our non-monetary sectors. We also rely, for instance, on over 80% of foreign exchange earnings from the products of the activities of the rural population, which constitute 90% of our population. For this reason, in considering the solution of human settlement problems, priority is attached to the rural areas where the scattered rural homesteads must be provided with adequate and reasonably accessible services and employment. In this effort, we are not only trying to improve the welfare of the rural population, but we are also attempting to minimize the rate and volume of rural to urban migration. Mr. President, we are trying to depart from the traditional concept which treats rural areas purely as agricultural occupation. We would wish to diversify the economic and occupational base of rural areas as much as possible. We see this as one of the means to foster the implementation of minimum standard in rural areas in case of housing, infrastructure, and services at minimum cost to the public sector. In this regard, Mr. President, we have instituted and intend to institute additional measures to facilitate the implementation of these policies and objectives. We have enacted land reform legislation bringing all land in the country under public control to reduce land speculation, resistance to development efforts, and to facilitate equitable availability of land to all persons. We have promulgated a self-help decree which defines public participation in the formulation and implementation of local development projects. The government also carried out an administrative decentralization in order to take services and decision-making authority nearer to the people, as well as to promote the growth of intermediate urban places within smaller rural hinterlands. All of these efforts, Mr. President, must be and are supported by consistent and necessary planning and physical implementation measures. Some of these include the planning and implementation of resettlement programs in rural areas and slum improvement programs in large urban centers. We have discovered that 80% of our total internal migration takes place from one rural area to another in search of adequate and fertile land, while the rest of the 20% move to large urban centers where they add to and constitute about 80% of the low-income population of the urban areas. In order to support the land reform decree and to promote regional resettlement programs, Mr. President, Uganda will carry out land capability and land carrying capacity studies on a national scale. A national land use plan based on these studies will greatly assist as a tool for locational decision, prediction of rural overpopulation, and a redirection of internal migration. Regional planning is also being pursued very seriously, and some of its major objectives are to foster an equitable geographical distribution of resources to facilitate the integration of rural and urban planning, and to encourage the integration of physical planning with social and economic planning. In concluding my statement, Mr. President, I wish to recall that during the Stockholm Conference on Human Environment, Uganda was one of the countries which offered facilities to host the secretariat of a new institution on human environment. Recently, when the President of Uganda addressed the 30th session of the United Nations General Assembly, he offered Uganda's preparedness, facilities, and its suitability to host any new institutional arrangement on human settlements that may result from Vancouver. Uganda is still much prepared to host any arrangements for human settlements, whether it will be an international secretariat or regional secretariat or training institute. Finally, Mr. President, We feel that in order to realize and achieve larger visions, this conference has vitally important decision to reach here in Vancouver. The Republic of Uganda wishes and expresses appreciation to be strongly associated with the making of such important decisions. We feel this is but a first and fundamental step to provide guidelines and inspirations for ultimate national actions and for practical applications of ideas and concepts developed in Vancouver. Thank you, Mr. President. Capsules, please.
An imbalance in the distribution of its population presents a problem to the government of Uganda. 70% of the people live on only 30% of the land area. As an experiment, therefore, a new settlement of farmers was established at Mubuku, close to the foothills of Mount Ruwenzori. Irrigation was begun in 1961, and by 1964, a small pilot scheme was complete. The main work was undertaken in 3 phases, the third of which is well underway. Farming is carried out under government supervision, and a strict crop rotation schedule is followed. Each holding consists of 3.2 hectares, which is plowed, disked and leveled before the settlers arrive. Tax relief and assistance by loans are available in the first year. Food is provided free for 6 months. Already, the 2,000 hectare scheme has proved a success. 834 hectares are allocated to farmers, and the rest is given over to pasture, eucalyptus forest, administration, and social amenities. Fodder is grown and sold direct to the livestock section of the scheme. Among the settlers are people from all the tribes of Uganda. They are there regardless of differing religious and political beliefs. Most of the produce is marketed through the farmers' cooperative, and it finds its way to the local markets. The main value of the scheme lies in its role as the pilot for other similar projects, because it has shown a way in which the living standards of the rural people can be raised. A wide-scale extension of the idea would obviously go a long way towards solving the imbalance of population problem, whereby too many people try to farm too little land, with the inevitable result of overcultivation and falling crops. For the farmers, it is a way to earn a better reward for their heavy labors.
I wish to thank the Minister of Provincial Administration of Uganda, and may I at the same time remind delegates who are including capsules in their presentation, the capsules are to be included within the time limits that the conference has established. I now give the floor to the Secretary of State for Community Facilities and Housing of Tunisia, His Excellency Mr. Labri Malaj.
Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi tout d'abord.
Mr. President, permit me first of all to read out a message from Mr. Habib Bourguiba, President of the Tunisian Republic, which has requested me to convey to you. I quote, Mr. President, it is a fortunate opportunity for me to extend to you and the distinguished delegates my warm satisfaction at seeing Vancouver in Canada, a country which is a friend, scene of international cooperation and meetings, to see the holding of the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements. It is therefore a message of hope that I am sending to you to greet through you the determination of the international community to confront jointly the problems which have arisen in the course of its evolution towards progress and prosperity. Now, there are no more urgent problems than those raised by human settlements. If we believe that man has been and remains the objective of all political action. In Tunisia, where all our actions derive precisely from this fundamental choice, our economic and social policy has always aimed at the promotion of man, in the belief that he can be the driving force in his own development. Employment, education, culture, and housing remain for us the high priorities in successive plans which my country has decided to implement towards its development. Such concerns stem from our major concern to face up to the imperatives of evolution, which follows from a global attitude based on the profound conviction that problems relating to human settlements can only find balanced solutions within the vigilance of national solidarity. But if the efforts made by all countries, by all national communities to resolve such problems are no doubt very appreciable and praiseworthy, the scope and often the urgency of the needs felt by the masses in the world, particularly in the developing countries, require a clearer realization and more sustained international action for cooperation and solidarity with respect for national identity, of course. The spirit which prevailed at your conference, and I'd like to greet the spirit of generosity which reigned, is evidence of the strengthening of this solidarity at the planetary level and constitutes the best guarantee for cooperation for the establishment of a new world economic order where every nation, every people, every human settlement can live and prosper in freedom and dignity. Let me express the hope that your meeting will be a brilliant success, and may its work lead to the adoption of concrete programs of cooperation for the whole of the international community. End of quotation.
Monsieur le Président, Excellences,
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, human settlements, the subject of our conference, are for all governments, in particular for developing countries, governments, which is the case with our country, a matter of major concern. In this field, Tunisia, under its president, has produced a policy, the end objective of which is man himself. Everything possible has been done to make it possible for man to recover his dignity, to live in decent conditions, and to benefit from improvements in the quality of life. But this is not too easy, and we always have to face the problem of matching the legitimate aspirations of the masses with a decent life, with the limited possibilities and resources of a country. However, our policy in this has always been clear. Our options have been precise and our objectives well defined. First of all, we have advocated action which would lead to a balance between regions, decentralization of the powers of decision and deconcentration of administrative structures all constitute in effect a leitmotif of this policy. Considerable sums of money have been reserved for rural activity, the purpose of which is to improve living conditions in the countryside, and which is now showing a tendency to be transformed into a veritable process of planned regional development, conceived and managed by regional and local managers after very broad consultation at all levels. In the matter of urbanization, all our communities have been, or will, by the end of this year, have been given master development plans worked out by architects and town planners, but these plans, which should protect cities against wild and unbridled urbanization, are only adopted officially and can be objected to by other parties after consultation with all the parties concerned. From the point of view of land, our action has always been guided by the need to crush speculation in the field. 3 land agencies have been created to promote, respectively, buildings for tourism, industry, and housing. Their role is to acquire land and to develop it with a view to reselling it at cost price. Legislative texts have given these agencies the right of preemption, even the right of expropriation for public use in predetermined areas which are going to be the sites of well-defined projects, because we believe that we must reconcile the right to personal property in land and ownership of land with the need for rational use of land with a view to cheap and planned town planning. We also feel that land is an element which we must not at any cost waste. That is why we have opted for the intensive development of urban and suburban zones while remaining within the limits of rates of occupation which would be humanly acceptable, 250 inhabitants per hectare. This density has been reflected, this approach to density has been reflected in collective vertical and horizontal structures. It makes it also possible to effect large savings with regard to the cost of development, infrastructure and transport. We've also opted for the creation of vast complexes capable of receiving citizens from all layers of the population, unlike the dormitory towns which we have built in the 60s. These vast conurbations have been endowed with the necessary infrastructure, schools, dispensaries, hospitals, youth houses, houses of culture, administrative buildings, commercial areas, and so on. Mr. President, the state gives massive assistance to housing construction. The 4-year plan, which ends this year, will have seen 76,000 housing units built. That is to say, we will have exceeded the estimates which had only scheduled 71,000. The housing sector, for which the planners had only reserved 11% of global investment, will have actually absorbed 17.8% of this investment. However, the aid from the state in the form of subsidies or loans, interest-free loans, goes to the social strata which have the least money, particularly to those people who want to live in the countryside or in the suburb. Indeed, our policy tends to encourage housing savings because we think the expansion of construction, if it is not to be inflationist, should avoid over-reliance on credit and the exaggerated import of building materials. Accordingly, a housing savings bank has been established. It pays 4% interest to those who belong to it during the savings period. In the course of this time, the state gives a bonus of 2%. At the end of 4 years, the bank gives to the party concerned an amount double to his savings at an interest of 4.5%. And the state intervenes to the extent of 1%. For our next 5-year plan, the Commission, the Sectoral Commission for Housing, has proposed the building of 125,000 housing units, which will meet needs created by demographic growth only. Tunisia has a 5 million population. The sums required by this program amount to 611 million dinars, or 15% of the overall investment scheduled for all sectors. Of these 125,000 housing units, 40,000 will be rural, 20,000 suburban, and 25,000 in economic urban type. The construction of these 85,000 units will be assisted in different degrees by the state. The rest, or 40,000 housing units, will be built by the private sector. Increased assistance is given to the promotion of the concentration of rural population in order to avoid dispersal of housing over the countryside, to settle people there and to reduce the exodus to the towns. The housing construction effort goes hand in hand with the school building, hospital building, sports stadia building, and centers for leisure and culture. This is the case with regard to primary and secondary education, for example, and the government effort has had the effect of making schools and colleges much nearer to the student, no matter how far-flung the area of our country. As to hospitals and dispensaries, the state is giving hospitals and dispensaries to towns and villages depending on their size according to a rigorously worked-out plan. The achievement of our new construction programs does not make us overlook the need to maintain our old architectural heritage. Thus, annually, the National Fund for the Improvement of Housing distributes about 1 million dinars in loans and subsidies to make it possible for private persons and to communities to fight against the deterioration of housing. This fund is financed primarily by contribution from the owners of housing based on a tenancy tax. Other renovation operations and restoration operations of areas are undertaken by the state and communities. Two agencies, the Agency for the Promotion of Investment and the Industrial Land Agency, channel industrial efforts to create employment in the most balanced way possible by offering encouragements and fiscal advantages in order to promote the deconcentration of industry and having it installed in rural areas. We may say that the results achieved are rather encouraging. The creation of jobs amounted to 442,000 jobs a year, which is a praiseworthy effort, although it's inadequate still, Mr. President. Efforts have been made to involve by fruitful dialogue the citizen himself in the design of his own housing, in his workplace and his leisure establishments, in planned human settlements, within the framework of an environment capable of bestowing a higher quality of life and thus making Tunisia viable and comfortable in all areas. For this, and thanks to adequate legislation with regard to building authority, we are trying to have an urbanization policy based on voluntary action prepared by the state with the purpose of avoiding proliferation of uncontrolled building and to protect our sites and preserve our historic monuments. Mr. President, Tunisia welcomes the efforts of all those who in the United Nations have tried to make public opinion more aware of the problems raised by human settlements. For us, development is a single whole. It forms a whole. We cannot conceive of it isolated from the social context. As far back as 1969, in March, our President stated, and I quote, "I am now convinced that housing does not go before, but goes at the same time, hand in hand with bread and clothing. When we are decently housed, we are more able to earn a living, and we are more aware of the need for effort, and we are more sensitive to economic imperatives. The success of economic action is determined by this social promotion." Ladies and gentlemen, on the subject of human settlements, we cannot refrain from thinking of those who have been robbed of their homes because of a policy of aggression and deliberate colonialism, a whole people driven out of its land by hate and racism. I'm thinking of the Palestinian people who are still described today as refugees. This people, Mr. President, has known no other human settlement but the tent, and the only environment it's had for 30 years has been a heroic and desperate struggle for its survival and the recovery of its dignity. This people, well, what has been done to put an end to its martyrdom? Men, old men, women, children languish in the most atrocious misery and poverty in spite of certain efforts of international solidarity. Have they not the right to a home, to a dignified life in their country finally freed from all domination? Mr. President, we are convinced that this great meeting, this Habitat Conference, will go down in the history of the United Nations, and that it will be of great benefit to all participants, and that all delegations will derive from it great benefit by comparing and contrasting their own experience with that of the various countries of the international community. Our hope is that the principles which are going to win unanimous consent, that the cooperative intents which are going to be expressed will be an inspiration to the action of all of us, governments and governed, and that the resolutions to be adopted will be applied unreservedly so that a better way of life can be forged for present and future generations, thanks to the will of the citizens of all countries, to the concern of governments, and the efficiency and permanence of international solidarity. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary of State for Community Facilities and Housing of Tunisia. The next speaker is the Federal Commissioner for Housing, Urban Development and Environment of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, His Excellency Wing Commander Mukhtar Mohammed, to whom I now give the floor.
Mr. President, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Federal Military Government of Nigeria, I would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, on your unanimous election, and through you, the government and people of Canada, on the excellent arrangements which have been made to ensure the success of Habitat, the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements. I also wish to thank the Governor General of Canada, His Excellency the Right Honorable Jules Lega, and the distinguished Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honorable Pierre Elliott Trudeau, for their inspiring statements at the formal opening of the conference. The decision of the United Nations to accept the generous invitation of the Government of Canada to hold this conference in the city of Vancouver is a realization of the commitment of your great country to the continuing search for global justice and meaningful cooperation in international economic relations and development. I would like to assure you, Mr. President, that my delegation intends to cooperate fully with you and the members of the Bureau in order to utilize effectively this unique opportunity to review globally the present state of human settlement as a basis for determining the various policy options available to governments and to formulate schemes of international action, proposals, and the appropriate institutions for implementing them. I earnestly hope that the results of this conference will add a new dimension to the concerted international efforts to implement the declaration and program of action for the establishment of the new international economic order. Mr. President, since the promulgation of the new international economic order in 1974 at the 6th special session of the General Assembly of the United Nations, there has been a tremendous spate of international activity aimed at emphasizing the purposive nature of interdependence amongst nations, between developed and developing countries as an essential prerequisite to human survival. This development is not confined to trade and financial matters, but extends inevitably to the basic issues of the environment, such as urban and rural settlements, the cleavages between existing institutions and new techniques, the provision of adequate social services, shortages of qualified manpower, pollution, and improvements in the lifestyles of the peoples. The readiness and dedication with which the international community responds to these challenges which face mankind will facilitate the promotion of a stable and secure world. There is, however, a temptation to think that the problems of human settlements are essentially a development question appropriate to developing countries like mine. Unfortunately, this is an oversimplification which focuses a disproportionate attention to housing and urban development, while ignoring the historical antecedents in developing countries where there was little organized and sustained action by the administering authorities to improve the quality of life of these people. These years of neglect have confronted the governments of developing countries with enormous problems of human environment with which they cannot effectively grapple in the light of the available resources. If one considers that the problem of the environment involves not only housing and urban development, but also the other subsystems in this family, it is easy to see that the threat to environmental harmony is a universal one. The developed countries that have managed to solve the primary problems of the human settlement are faced with the secondary problems of air and water pollution on an alarming scale. These problems are, ironically, the direct results of technological advancement. Be that as it may, the developing countries are coping with these problems in varying degrees as best as they can. Nevertheless, there are still poor housing conditions, insanitary environment, and unplanned towns and villages. Rural migration to the cities is a common feature in most developing countries, and these complicate effective management of the environment. Some of the factors that are responsible for this trend are lack of economic opportunities in the rural areas, rapidly disintegrating social structures, poor medical and social facilities, and the illusory search for a better life.
Indiscriminate reclamation by filling water bodies In Nigeria, as in many other countries, large numbers of people are deserting the traditional way of life, agriculture, and moving to the cities in an effort to find a higher standard of living and a better reward for their labors. But the cities cannot cope with such a large influx of people. Overcrowding, poor housing, and unemployment and congestion are the inevitable results. New roads can be built, it is true, but it takes time. If space is as short as it is in the islands on which Lagos is built, land can be reclaimed for new housing, but not quickly enough to keep pace with the rate of new arrivals. Sewage must be dispersed of, electricity provided, shops and markets built. But while all this was being done, the environmental problem became every day more serious. The demand outruns the services available, and the evil feeds upon itself. In the past, Nigeria's planning has not been as successful as it should have been. New housing settlements have been badly designed. Too many people have now moved in, relations and friends from the country. They are already slums in the making. The solution was to be found in the country and not the towns themselves. When the Kainji Dam was built, large areas had to be flooded and the scattered population was moved together. The amenities that they had sought in the cities, like schools, piped water, medical care, and so on, could all be provided. Other similar schemes, often in partnership between the government and the people, have followed the same pattern, and there are more to come. Better methods of farming and more modern equipment could raise the standards of rural life and relieve pressure on the towns. With government help and the goodwill of the people, Nigeria's human settlement problems are beginning to be solved. Great effort and much money are going into making the country a real home for all Nigerians.
The federal government of Nigeria, in recognition of its responsibility to the people of Nigeria, has recently created a ministry specifically charged with the problems of housing, urban development, and environment to give priority to the problems of housing and urban development. Nigeria recognizes that shelter represents one of the most basic human needs and has, no doubt, profound effect on the health, welfare, and quality of life of the individual. The shortage of housing units in urban centers has been arranged by rapid migration to the cities. Accordingly, the federal military government has appointed a team of consultants to study the peculiar problems of 20 major urban areas. This is the first step in Nigeria to deal with the problem in a comprehensive manner. In addition to the efforts made in the private sector, Nigeria has built within the last 2 years 59,000 housing units, and by 1980 it is planned to increase the number to 200,000. As a parallel development, a land bank commission has been set up to acquire land in anticipation of urban development. This will facilitate rational planning and minimize land speculation and its negative consequences. Meanwhile, a substantial sum of money has been voted for the improvement and rehabilitation of roads in all the major urban centers in the country. Already, firms of consultants have been commissioned to prepare physical master plans for all the major urban centers in Nigeria. Mr. President, our housing policy is aimed at providing our people with decent accommodation as well as essential support public utilities, particularly for the low and medium income groups. The existing urban centers will be replanned along modern lines. Satellite towns will be located adjacent to some of the existing urban centers whose infrastructural facilities have been extremely overloaded. Generous credit facilities will be provided to encourage the construction of more houses in order to stimulate private home ownership. It is intended to achieve this by transforming the Nigerian Building Society into a mortgage bank and the reorganization of the Federal Housing Authority so that it can perform the duties of a building society. State-owned housing corporations, as well as private and public cooperative housing societies, will be encouraged and financially assisted to promote this development. Nigeria has realized that Lagos can no longer efficiently accommodate the functions and responsibilities of the nation's capital. Consequently, it has been decided to move the capital to a new location, and the process of planning has already begun. Among the most serious obstacles in the construction of housing units is the rising cost of building materials and the shortage of executive capacity. In most cases, the cost of building materials has risen considerably, and the trend is expected to continue. It is the intention of the federal military government to stabilize the prices of essential building materials by increasing local production and subsidizing imports. Nigeria has plans to improve substantially its health service. Existing towns, as well as proposed new ones, are to be provided with central sewerage systems, adequate waste disposal arrangements, and stormwater drainage. Efforts will be made to provide the rural communities with basic public health requirements. Household refuse collection and disposal arrangements will be improved in the urban and rural areas. Clearly, Mr. President, the above catalog of the program of the Federal Military Government of Nigeria represents a modest effort on our part to alleviate the difficulties of our people in order to give them a better quality of life, our enormous development programs notwithstanding. Nevertheless, we believe that prosperity in Nigeria depends largely on the health and welfare of the people. Nigeria is also aware of the need to cooperate with other developing countries in search of acceptable solutions to the common problems of human settlements. Accordingly, the federal military government of Nigeria has decided to maintain the level of its contributions of $96,000 to the United Nations Environment Program and $32,000 to the Human Settlement Foundation. This is because of our faith in the catalytic role of the United Nations to evolve guidelines and policy options for the solution of the global problems of the environment. I trust, Mr. President, that all the delegations to this conference are unanimous in their agreement that this is the time for international action to promote the living standard of all the peoples of the world, particularly those in the developing countries, in order to ensure the dignity of man, social justice, and promote the aims and objectives of the new international economic order. Finally, Mr. President, I would like to place on record the appreciation of my delegation for the good work done by the distinguished Secretary General of Habitat, Mr. Enrique Peñalosa, and his staff in promoting the work of the preparatory committee for this conference. I'm glad to observe also the distinctive role played by the chairman of the committee, Reverend Father George Muhoho of Kenya, and his colleagues on the Bureau for their perseverance and hard work. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Federal Commissioner for Housing, Urban Development and Environment of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. I thank him for his kind words of tribute to the Secretary General and myself and to the host government. I think it was expressed so well that maybe others are able then to take that as a matter of record, unless one would like to suggest otherwise, and be able to devote more of their time to their substantive input into their presentations. I now give the floor to the Minister of Construction of Cuba, His Excellency Mr. Levi Farah Balmaceda.
Synthesis of our report due to the shortage of time, but we shall turn it over today we shall give you a complete copy of our report. Our delegation is attending this conference with the purpose of exchanging experience and views on the points referred to in the agenda of our conference, with a view to giving its cooperation to give effect to those processes which would enable us to achieve these objectives. For the Cuban socialist community, man has the highest meaning, as is stated in the preamble of the Constitution of the Republic, which was recently approved by all of our people, and which fulfills the wish of José Martí, who stated, "I want that the first law of our Republic should be the faith of Cubans in the full dignity of man." The world of today, as we all know, finds itself in an intensive process of change, and the universal consensus has been reached that this change requires urgently new forms of economic and political relationships between all nations. Cuba has attended various international meetings, and in these meetings their representatives, including our Prime Minister, Comandante Fidel Castro, have expressed clearly the solid and unconditional support of our country for all oppressed peoples who are fighting to achieve their liberation from the colonialist yoke, and the Cuban position favorable to the right of underdeveloped countries to the full exercise of their sovereignty and the unrestricted use of their natural resources as basic requirements to bring about the new international economic order which we are striving for and which we desire. We look with satisfaction that these aspects are covered in the draft Declaration of Principles of this international conference. Without great changes in the international relationships, Mr. President and fellow delegates, there cannot exist any policy whatsoever of human settlements, nor could we create worthy living conditions in presently underdeveloped countries which have been robbed and plundered of their natural resources during centuries by the imperialist countries, which today show to the impoverished masses the insolent spectacle of the looting and the waste of their consumer societies. In the keynote speech to the first Congress of the Communist Party, Comandante Fidel Castro pointed out, in the first decade of our revolution, when the blockade was at its height and the country was defending itself desperately against imperialist aggressions, our economy grew slowly. Between 1961 and 1965, the global social product increased only to the tune of 1.9% per annum. Between 1966 and 1970, this growth rate amounted to 3.9%. Between 1971 and 1975, it reached a truly impressive rate of more than 10% of annual growth. Today, we can state with pride that we are a country without unemployment, without racial discrimination, without hungry people, without beggars, without gambling, without prostitution, without drugs, without illiteracy, without poor slum areas, and without sick people left to their fate. Our public education and public health are models of social success which are bringing about admiration in the eyes of many people of the world. With respect to rural housing, which was scattered and miserable until 1959, and with the purpose of eliminating the difference between the urban and rural conditions, we are now carrying out a policy designed to give a structure to the system of human settlements in farm areas, agricultural areas. And with that, the shift from the country to the city of Cuba has been limited. The excessive growth of Havana, whose relative weight in the total population of the country in 1958 was 23.9%, was reduced in 1970 to 20.5%. Mr. President, fellow delegates, this conference of the United Nations on human settlements is guided by the most noble and praiseworthy objectives. Nonetheless, it will not be judged in the future by what it wanted to do, but rather by the concrete steps which it managed to take to achieve these purposes. This is the responsibility which falls upon all of us who are met here. The government of Cuba once again restates its readiness to contribute actively within our possibilities to find and to apply the machinery which would give effect to international cooperation in this field. We realize the difficulties which this involves. We are living in a world of transition where there exist both the circumstances and realities of the very diverse nature. It is not easy to speak the language of international cooperation with those whose only law is that of exploiting those of the transnational corporations. It is not easy to imagine the human humanity, the higher one to which we all are aspiring, where we find the great differences of class, racism, discrimination against women, illiteracy, among other social blights. It is not easy to reconcile the overriding concern of man found in this meeting and the reality of bloody tyrannies, crime, torture, and the brutal crushing of human dignity. Nonetheless, we are optimistic. The march of history cannot be stopped. New ideas, new concepts are becoming anchored within the minds of peoples and in these rules and standards of their international relationships. And the United Nations contribute to this by its action and its initiatives, which, as can be seen by this conference, every day reflect more and more, although not fully, the changes which have occurred in the world and the aspirations of mankind. We are sure that the revolutionary struggle of the people and the workers will widen even more these horizons. The future, without any doubt whatsoever, belongs to solidarity, friendship, cooperation, and peace between the peoples of the world. Cuba wholeheartedly ascribes to these ideals, which are the very essence of our revolution. We are a people which is working very hard for our future. We are not hoping for luxury, but the revolution has given us the treasure of a society which is firmly united, wherein man is really a brother to fellow man, in which we have banished exploitation, privileges, and selfish interests, and which is capable to feel as our own suffering, the suffering of any people in any corner of the earth. Internationalism is, in our society, the highest measure of a revolutionary. A people had to be internationalist, which is educated in the principles of Marxism, Leninism, and which is also known in its relationships with the Soviet Union and other socialist countries the most inspiring example of friendship, collaboration, and generosity. Today, Cuba is a modest bulwark, but a sure one of all people who are fighting for their freedom against underdevelopment and backwardness. We do not have a lot, but what we have, we can share with our brothers who are most in need. Doctors, builders, and other Cuban specialists have given and are giving their help to the great heroic people of Vietnam. Likewise, we have given our support and cooperation to other peoples, Jamaica, Tanzania, Yemen, Algeria, to the glorious people of Angola, which was the victim of brutal imperialist aggression. Not only have we given the help and the blood of our fighters, but also all the economic and technical help which we have in our hands. The greatest Cuban of the past century, José Martí, taught us that country is mankind. And the supreme leader of our revolution, companion, Fidel Castro, has taught us the idea that the world of tomorrow must be the world of solidarity, the world of internationalism. Therefore, Mr. President, we Cubans will not fail to have the will, enthusiasm, and the necessary courage to achieve and to encourage the purposes of this conference. Thank you, sir. Now, the film, please. The film, please. Please, the film.
Ese era el...
This was the habitat. This is how many people in Cuba lived once. Of course, this was not only a question of housing. There were not houses, there were no working conditions, there was no education, there was no health. It was a miserable life, which was a common denominator in the cities, country, sea, and the mountain.
The land needed in the right place, at the right time, and at the appropriate cost, cannot be achieved solely through taxation.
Para transformar esa situación hacia...
Local, regional, and national interests
Now, we needed more than good intentions. What we needed was a social revolution.
Este es uno de los resultados de...
This is one of the results of this revolution. One of the new type rural communities that was created, built in Cuba. The most important is that life has changed for all. Education, work, and health are guaranteed in both the town and the country. Change the life shows this change in 5 persons. One, a sugar worker, a mountain farmer, a miner, and a farm woman of the plains.
I wish to thank the Minister of Construction of Cuba. The next speaker is the Vice President of the Council on the Affairs of the People's Council of Romania, His Excellency Mr. Romeo Dragomir Escu.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames,
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honorable mission to convey to you the message which the President of the Socialist Republic of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, has sent to the participants in the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements. I quote, "It's a particular pleasure for me to most warmly to greet the participants of the Conference of the United Nations on Human Settlements and extend to them my best wishes for success in their work at this important international meeting. Having participated actively in international life in the general struggle to promote a new policy, broad cooperation and collaboration between states, Romania supports all initiatives and actions designed to contribute to the unifying and intensifying of the efforts of the peoples of the world to the constructive solution of the great problems of the world today, the guaranteeing of the progress and civilization of mankind. With this in mind, our country welcomed with interest the initiative of convening and organizing the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, the first World Intergovernmental Conference devoted to the complex matters of the life and prospects for towns and villages in the world today. I believe that this conference, which is one of the manifestations, large-scale manifestations, which have taken place under the aegis of the United Nations, will make a particularly positive contribution to the debate and the search for ways and means of solving certain problems with profound implications for the existence of people, progress, and the civilization of mankind as a whole. It also forms part of the international debate on food, energy, natural resources, population, science, and technology. And it's a new and important subject flowing from the concerns of peoples connected with the building of a better and more just world. Romania considers that the development of human settlements, the improvement of the level of civilization, depends primarily on the efforts of each country itself and the way in which economic and social development of each people is brought about, and the way in which the use is made of material and human resources, and the dissemination and the development of the advances in